When we think of the Second World War, our minds often jump to the Blitz, to D-Day, or the Eastern Front. But for millions in Asia, the war began much earlier. It didn't start with the invasion of Poland in 1939. It began in the heart of China years before Europe was engulfed in flames. The seeds were sown in 1931, when Imperial Japan invaded Manchuria. This was a naked act of aggression, a brutal land grab that the international community condemned but did little to stop. Japan was testing the waters, and it found them welcomingly placid. This initial invasion was just the opening act in a much larger, more devastating drama. In July 1937, a minor skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge, just outside Beijing, provided the pretext Japan needed. This incident was the spark that ignited a full-scale, undeclared war. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun, and it would become one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Japan's highly trained Kwantung Army poured into China, expecting a swift victory against the fractured Chinese forces. They captured Beijing and Tianjin within weeks. Then they set their sights on Shanghai, China's bustling cosmopolitan heart. The Battle of Shanghai was a brutal 3-month slog, a meat grinder that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. With Europe distracted by its own burgeoning conflict, Japan saw a golden opportunity. The colonial empires of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, which had dominated Southeast Asia for centuries, now looked vulnerable. Their goal was audacious: to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a vast, self-sufficient empire rich in oil, rubber, and other vital resources. This was a euphemism for a brutal new empire, one ruled from Tokyo. On December 7th, 1941, the world's attention was fixed on Pearl Harbor, but that was just one part of a massive, coordinated offensive that swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The speed and success of the Japanese expansion were stunning. It was a blitzkrieg on a scale the world had never seen. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces landed in Thailand and Malaya. They bombed American airfields in the Philippines. They seized Guam and Wake Island Desert, the carefully constructed edifice of Western colonial power, which had seemed so permanent, began to crumble with breathtaking speed. For the Allied powers, and it was a period of shocking defeats and humiliating retreats, a desperate scramble to respond to an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The fall of the Philippines was a particularly bitter blow for the United States. American and Filipino forces, and under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, fought a valiant but doomed delaying action. When MacArthur was ordered to escape to Australia, he famously vowed, "I shall return." By mid-1942, the rising sun flew over a vast new empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. They had achieved their initial objectives with a speed and ferocity that shocked the world. The war in Asia was not just a conflict of armies, it was a war against civilians. The concept of a co-prosperity sphere was a fiction that masked a reality of systematic exploitation and terror. Atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of behavior. The suffering inflicted upon the people of occupied Asia was immense and multifaceted. Following the surrender of American and Filipino troops in the Philippines, some 75,000 prisoners were forced on the Bataan death march. Starving, sick, and exhausted, they were marched for over 60 miles in scorching tropical heat. Those who fell behind were shot, bayoneted, or beheaded. Thousands perished on this horrific journey, a brutal introduction to the horrors of life in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Forced labor was another pillar of Japan's war economy. Millions of civilians and Allied prisoners of war were conscripted to build railways, airfields, and other infrastructure projects. The most infamous of these was the Thai-Burma Railway, also known as the Death Railway. Under hellish conditions, malaria, dysentery, starvation, and constant brutality from their guards, prisoners hacked a railway line through dense and unforgiving jungle. It is estimated that for every sleeper laid, one life was lost. Beyond the deliberate acts of cruelty, the war brought widespread famine and societal collapse. In Vietnam, A combination of Japanese requisitioning of rice and Allied bombing led to a devastating famine in 1944 and 45, killing up to 2 million people. Cities like Manila, once the Pearl of the Orient, were systematically destroyed. During its liberation in 1945, the city was the scene of ferocious urban combat and a horrific massacre of civilians. Across the region, thousands of women, known euphemistically as comfort women, were forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military, a crime that continues to cause deep pain and controversy to this day. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 stands as one of the greatest military disasters in British history. It was supposed to be an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the East. But the Japanese didn't come from the sea. In a brilliant and daring campaign, they cycled and marched down the Malayan Peninsula through what the British had considered impassable jungle terrain. On February 15th, General Arthur Percival surrendered the city and its 80,000 defenders, a humiliation that signalled the beginning of the end for the British Empire in Asia. The fight then moved to the jungles of Burma, a brutal and often forgotten theatre of the war. This campaign was vital. For the Allies, Burma was the back door into China and the only route through which they could supply Chiang Kai-shek's beleaguered nationalist forces via the famous Burma Road. The initial fighting was a disaster for the Allies, who were forced into a long, desperate retreat through punishing terrain, as all the way back to the Indian border. This campaign was a truly multinational effort, a fact often overlooked in Western-centric histories. The bulk of the ground forces in the newly formed British 14th Army were, in fact, soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. They were joined by Gurkhas from Nepal, renowned for their ferocity in close-quarters combat. Troops from East and West Africa also played a crucial role, serving in logistics, engineering and combat roles. These colonial soldiers fought and died in staggering numbers, battling in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable, far from home, for an empire that had subjugated their own people. After years of defeat and stalemate, the tide in Burma began to turn under the command of the brilliant and charismatic General William Slim. He rebuilt the 14th Army, instilling a new sense of purpose and developing innovative jungle warfare tactics. He understood that malaria and dysentery were as deadly as the enemy. In 1944, the Japanese launched their Yugo offensive, a final desperate gamble to invade India. At the epic battles of Imphal and Kohima, the 14th Army, vastly outnumbered at times, held their ground and then utterly destroyed the attacking Japanese forces. It was a stunning victory, one of the greatest of the entire war, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese army in Southeast Asia. By 1944, the sheer industrial might of the United States began to decisively shift the balance of power in the Pacific. The relentless island-hopping campaign, led by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, was clawing back territory from the Japanese, one bloody island at a time. Victories at Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were crucial because they provided the United States with air bases. For the first time, American long-range B-29 Superfortress bombers were within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. A new and terrible phase of the war was about to begin, one that would bring the conflict directly to Japan's civilian population. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan was ruthless and devastating. General Curtis LeMay switched tactics to low-level incendiary raids at night. Japan's cities, largely constructed of wood and paper, were incredibly vulnerable to fire. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, created a firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people and left 1 million homeless. Despite this unimaginable destruction and the complete collapse of their position in Burma and the Pacific, the military hardliners who controlled Japan refused to surrender. They prepared for a final, apocalyptic battle on the home islands, vowing to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Allied planners projected that an invasion of Japan could cost over 1 million Allied casualties and many millions of Japanese lives. It was in this context that President Harry S. Truman made one of the most momentous decisions in history. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a single atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The city was instantly obliterated, and an estimated 80,000 people were killed in the blast, with tens of thousands more dying later from radiation sickness. 3 days later, with the Japanese leadership still hesitating and the Soviet Union declaring war and invading Manchuria, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio for the first time ever, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender. The Second World War was finally over. For decades, the popular narrative of the Second World War, especially in the West, has been dominated by the European and Pacific theatres. The immense contributions and sacrifices of soldiers from across the British Empire were often relegated to a footnote. The 14th Army, which won the decisive victory in Burma, was nicknamed the Forgotten Army. These were the men from India, Africa, and Nepal who fought and died in some of the war's most brutal conditions. Their stories were lost, overshadowed by tales of D-Day and Dunkirk. In recent years, however, there's been a growing movement to reclaim these lost histories. Historians, documentary filmmakers, and community groups are working to shed light on the vital role played by colonial troops. Projects like the Forgotten Warriors Initiative are dedicated to recording the oral histories of surviving African veterans. Books and documentaries are now detailing the experiences of the Indian soldiers who formed the largest volunteer army in history. This effort is not just about correcting the historical record. It is about paying a long overdue debt of honor to the millions of men who fought for an empire that would soon cease to exist. This process of remembrance is also about bridging a significant generational gap for younger generations in both Asia and the West. The Second World War can feel like ancient histories. The world has changed so much, but the legacy of the war is all around us, embedded in the borders of modern nations, the alliances that shape our world, and the unresolved tensions that still flare up. By uncovering the untold stories of the war in Asia, we can gain a deeper understanding of how our contemporary world was forged in the crucible of that conflict. Ultimately, remembering the full story of the Second World War in Asia is a crucial act of historical empathy. It forces us to look beyond simplistic narratives and confront the immense complexity and human cost of the conflict. It reminds us that the war was a truly global event, with heroes and victims and villains of every nationality. By honoring the forgotten fighters and acknowledging the full scope of the suffering, we not only create a more complete and honest picture of our shared past, but we also arm ourselves with the knowledge needed to navigate the challenges of the future. The echoes of that war have not faded. They are still with us, and we owe it to those who lived and died through it to listen.